Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here to talk about the Sceaux Ball by Honoré de Balzac. This is the second story in my complete set of Honoré de Balzac. And this one at first glance seems to be a bit of a tragedy. It's a tragedy if you look at it through the lens of a romance, but on the other hand, it's difficult to feel that this is any sort of tragedy, that a extremely wealthy woman marrying into a wealthy family and becoming a countess and having a relatively comfortable life can be considered a tragedy. The only tragedy here is that through her own pride and ideas of society, she didn't end up marrying a man who would have given her everything that she wanted in life and who she loved. Instead, she married a man who is very much in love with her, but she had to give up the man she loved because of her own ideas about who she should marry in her own position. And so in that sense, in the romantic sense, it's a tragedy, but in reality, it's no tragedy at all. It's hard to feel much sympathy for a woman who is so pretentious, so stuck up, that she was unwilling to marry what she saw as a man who was beneath her despite being in love with him. And so, once again, Balzac is back with this critique of this upper class society. And he begins by telling us about the young lady's father. So we are looking at the Comte de Fontaine, who is a Bourbon supporter. So he is a royalist, and he has sunk a lot of his fortune, a lot of his money into supporting the monarchy of France, even as they are in exile. Despite the coming of the Republic, he is unwilling to take any appointments or to sort of side with this new regime that's in place. He remains loyal to the monarchy throughout political events, and it pays off for him because when the monarchy returns, the Second Revolution, and I'm learning quite a bit about French history here, the Second Revolution occurs, and he is made a brigadier general and is given the Legion of Honor, and he suddenly feels that, his loyalty has been well paid for, and he expects to get a return on the loans that he has given to the royal family, and he feels that it's his due to associate with the court. And so off he goes, and he gets an audience with the king, but he is received both coldly by the king and by those in the inner court, and he is quite offended, quite affronted that the people that he considers the upstarts of the empire, so some of the people who were supportive of the Republic and who took high-ranking positions in the Republic, are now in the favor of the king now that he has returned. And despite all this, despite his going back to his country home and thinking, maybe this should be done with, when the chance occurs, he once again throws in his lot with the king. There was 100 days exile. I had to look this up. Louis XVIII went into exile for 100 days in 1815, and our character, Monsieur de Fontaine, goes with him. And there's a wonderful quote here. Balzac says, "When he perceived that the companions of the king's exile were in higher favor than the brave men who had protected sword in hand against the establishment of the Republic, he may perhaps have hoped to derive greater profit from this journey into foreign lands than from active and dangerous service in his country." And so instead of serving in the country to defend the king, to defend the monarchy, he decides it's in his best interest to mortgage his land and flee with the king into exile for who knows however long. And off he goes. And in exile, that's when he becomes somewhat close to the king. Louis XVIII begins to like him in some ways for his wit, because he's somewhat amusing. And so things start to look up for Fontaine, and one by one he gets his sons appointed to high-ranking positions within the civil service. Balzac describes the situation as, things are new, and so people who would perhaps be jealous or offended at these appointments aren't really looking at the civil service as, a place for advancement. They don't see it as sort of the cash cow that Fontaine certainly does. And so these appointments are very quiet and sort of under wraps. And so there's no one to be jealous of him. There's really no one to oppose his position, the ear that he has to the king. And he has quite a large family. In fact, he has 3 daughters, and he thinks the best way to get these daughters married off is to mention them to the king one by one. And so he mentions the first daughter, and the king is more than happy to help Fontaine find a suitable match for his eldest daughter. And he even influences Fontaine into changing his perception about, what proper marriages are for the upper class. And so these are men who have sort of just recently come into the aristocracy. Just a generation or so ago, they were of the merchant class, so to speak. And so he marries off his daughters to his eldest 2 daughters to some very wealthy men. They'll be well looked after. They'll have a great fortune, even if they don't have those titles that in the back of his mind he would have thought before that his daughters deserved. But we come to the youngest daughter, Emily, and she is the youngest child in the family. She is doted upon. She is very beautiful and very witty, and so everyone is sort of in love with her. And her father has extremely high hopes for her. The mother has extremely high hopes. The mother was willing to let her 2 older daughters go to men without title, but she would really prefer if her youngest, if the most loved of the family, were to marry a man with title. And so the whole process starts when she is 14 years old. Her father begins to look for a husband for her. She goes to all these parties and balls, but because of how spoiled she was as a child, she has been brought up to think that she only deserves the best. She has this ideal of the perfect man, and apart from being good looking, being extremely good looking, being witty, being intelligent, most importantly, he must be a peer. He must be able to give her a title. She wants to be a countess at least. Now, as I said, her father, Fontaine, has been very close to the king, and he has, through his relationship, been able to exploit it to get many members of his family, all his sons, appointed to good positions, and to get his 2 oldest daughters married. But by the time the 3rd daughter is ready to be married, the king is very much annoyed with him. And in fact, de Fontaine has fallen out of favor and no longer has the king's ear or the king's help. And in fact, the king dies not long after. And so he is really on his own to try to marry off his daughter, Emily. And he doesn't have that privilege of being close with the king anymore. And there is another great quote here that sort of describes the situation he was in prior to this. Thanks to the Comte de Fontaine's good sense, wit, and tact, every member of his numerous family, however young, ended up, as he jestingly told his sovereign, in attaching himself like a silkworm to the leaves of the pay list. And so he has, gotten his whole family into good positions, and he hasn't been modest about it. He is, joking to the king that, look, I've done this. Look what I've done. And the king has just had enough. And so Emily is on her own. It's up to her father to find a husband for her. And the father presents, numerous good men, but Emily has been taught to have extremely high standards. As I said, she only wants to marry a peer. She would rather be a nun. She says she would rather die alone in a nunnery than to marry a man who wasn't a peer. And she's described as being not only spoiled, but she is tyrannizing young men. She is flirting with them, letting them fall in love with her, letting them propose and have hopes, and then dashing those hopes. She is what you would describe, she is what Jane Austen would describe as an accomplished woman. If you get an accomplished woman, if you get the joke there, but she is not only well educated, but she is fairly accomplished in painting. She speaks obviously French because, she's French, but she also speaks Italian and English almost flawlessly. And she has a lovely singing voice, and she is able to converse on almost any topic. She can talk about Dutch painters, she can talk about literature, and so she is a very well-educated, very beautiful woman who you would think would be able to find a husband very quickly, if only she didn't have unrealistic standards. And Balzac describes her as making a plaything out of anything that comes into hand the way that a spoiled child would. And so finally she reaches the age of 22 and her father says, I give up. It is now up to you to find a husband. I will support whoever you choose. And if you choose someone bad, if your marriage goes badly, don't blame me. I will not be embarrassed yet another time. If you marry, you will be, staying with your husband. I will not welcome you back into my household. Your decisions are your own. The consequences are your own. And so that brings us to the Sceaux ball. The Sceaux ball is this country ball that is really for the middle class. People of Emily's rank don't go to this ball, but it's become fashionable for the aristocracy to go out to this ball once or twice a year. It's just the thing you do. And so off she goes with her uncle, with her father, with her sisters and her sisters-in-law, and they go to this country ball where she expects to sort of be the center of attention, to have everyone look at this noble, aristocratic woman who comes in these silks. Everybody else is wearing cotton. And there's this realization when she realizes that all these middle-class women, all these women in cotton dresses, less fine than hers, are having just as good a time as a woman at one of the balls she's used to would. And she comes to this realization, the middle class can have fun too. The middle class are not, miserable and looking up to the aristocracy in awe. They are living perfectly fine lives. And if only this could have been a realization for her, but she remains spoiled. She remains firm in these high ideals about who she should marry. She catches sight of a young man there. By his demeanor, she assumes that he obviously must be a gentleman. He obviously must be someone of quality, someone with title. And she doesn't speak to him at this ball. She just sort of stares longingly. And she begins to ride through the neighborhood, hoping to come across him. And one day she does, and she realizes that he is Monsieur de Maximilien Longueville. And it's kind of curious because we don't know whether the de is supposed to be in his name. It's simply the way the servants introduce him when he arrives. The de, of course, is often a signifier in French culture of nobility, of that aristocratic background. And so by calling him de Longueville, you would assume that he is of her class. Now, she doesn't know for sure. He's very hush-hush about it. And she falls head over heels in love with him. And I won't tell you how it ends, but let's just say that she gets her title, she gets her money, but perhaps she doesn't get the love that she craved. She doesn't get everything she ever wanted. And as evident in the final scene of this story, if only she hadn't been so obsessed with, marrying within her station, and if only she had married for love, she could have had everything she ever wanted anyway. Instead, she ended up marrying someone that perhaps she wasn't all that in love with, simply because she had expectations about what her position in society should be. She wanted to be addressed as a countess. And so, if you look at it in that sense, it is a bit of a tragedy for her. But as I said, on the other hand, is it really a tragedy if you end up wealthy and a countess in the end and with a husband very much in love with you? Is it a tragedy if you're going to inherit a vast amount of money and titles for your children? I wouldn't say so. But Balzac does a wonderful job here of showing exactly how unhappy being so obsessed with, marrying into the upper class can make you. And I quite enjoyed this. I think I enjoyed this more than At the Sign of the Cat and the Rocket. This was a great little story, definitely something I would recommend. Next, I will be moving on to a story called The Purse. And just one final note here. So the Sceaux ball was published in 1829. And as I think I've mentioned in past videos, I unfortunately have no idea who the translator of my set of Balzac is. The translator is not listed. So I'm enjoying my journey with Balzac so far. If you join me for this one, be sure to let me know what you thought of this story in the comments below. And if not, let me know if this is something that you think you would be interested in reading at some point, because it really was a very entertaining story, and I am beginning to love Honoré de Balzac even more.